You share something that's been crushing your soul, and they respond with, "At least you have your health." You open up about a loss that's shattered your world, and they say, "Everything happens for a reason." You reveal a trauma that's been haunting you for years, and they offer, "Just think positive thoughts." Every time you reach out in genuine pain, seeking understanding, or even just acknowledgement, the people around you seem determined to shrink your experience down to something manageable, something fixable, something that shouldn't really be that big of a deal. And you're left wondering, why can't they just witness my pain without trying to fix it, minimize it, or explain it away? You start to believe that maybe your pain isn't valid. Maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe everyone else is handling life better than you are, and there's something fundamentally wrong with your inability to just get over it. But Jung's framework reveals something profound about this pattern, something that will completely change how you understand these painful interactions. The people who minimize your pain aren't doing it because your pain isn't real. They're doing it because your pain is too real. And their inability to sit with your suffering reveals more about their own unconscious wounds than it does about the validity of your experience. Once you understand the psychology behind pain minimization, you'll never take it personally again. But more importantly, you'll discover how to protect your emotional truth from people who can't handle it. Because what Jung understood about this dynamic will disturb you. It reveals something uncomfortable about human nature that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. Jung's work suggests that when people minimize your pain, they're not responding to you. They're responding to something in themselves that your pain is triggering. In Jungian terms, your authentic suffering activates what we might call unbearable recognition in others. Your pain reminds them of their own unprocessed wounds, their own capacity for deep suffering, their own vulnerability to life's inevitable losses. And rather than face those uncomfortable truths about their own human fragility, they unconsciously work to minimize your pain so they can minimize their own. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. People would react to others' suffering not with empathy, but with what he described as defensive projection. They would project their own fear of pain onto the suffering person and then try to fix, minimize, or explain away that pain. Just think positive really means, please don't remind me that positive thinking couldn't save me from my own losses. Everything happens for a reason really means, please don't show me that chaos and meaninglessness are possible. At least you have your health really means, please don't make me face how little control any of us actually have. Jung's framework reveals that pain minimization is never about helping you. It's about helping them avoid their own unconscious terror of suffering. Your raw, authentic pain threatens the psychological defenses they've built to avoid facing their own wounds. So they unconsciously work to get you to put your pain back in whatever box they keep their own pain locked away in. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about this dynamic, something that explains why the people closest to you are often the ones who minimize your pain most aggressively. Because the psychological mechanism behind pain minimization reveals a shadow aspect of human connection that most people never want to acknowledge. Jung's work suggests that authentic pain creates what we might call intimacy threat in relationships. When you share real suffering, you're asking others to meet you in a place of genuine vulnerability and depth. But most people are unconsciously terrified of that level of intimacy. Real intimacy requires the ability to sit with discomfort, uncertainty, and emotional intensity without trying to fix or change anything. It demands presence rather than solutions, witnessing rather than advice. And Jung understood that most people lack the psychological capacity for this kind of conscious intimacy because they haven't learned to be present with their own pain. When you share authentic suffering, you're unconsciously inviting others into their own depths. You're asking them to access their own capacity for deep feeling, their own willingness to face life's genuine difficulties. For people who have spent years avoiding their own emotional depths, this invitation feels dangerous. Your pain threatens to pull them into territories of their own psyche that they've worked hard to avoid. So they minimize your pain to maintain the shallow intimacy they can actually handle. They offer solutions because sitting with unsolvable pain requires emotional maturity they haven't developed. They rush to positive reframing because staying present with darkness requires inner strength they haven't cultivated. They minimize your experience because witnessing authentic suffering demands a capacity for depth that scares them. Jung observed that people can only meet you as deeply as they've learned to meet themselves. When you share pain that comes from deeper places than they've ever explored within themselves, they literally can't follow you there. Instead of admitting their limitation, they unconsciously work to bring you back to emotional territories they can navigate. But Jung's framework reveals something even more complex about this dynamic. Because your reaction to having your pain minimized might be revealing something unconscious about your own psychological patterns. Jung's insights suggest that when people minimize your pain, part of your reaction isn't just about their invalidation. It's about something you're unconsciously seeking that you might not want to admit to yourself. In Jungian terms, there's often what we might call validation hunger, operating beneath your desire to share pain. An unconscious need to have your suffering witnessed, acknowledged, and perhaps even admired. Jung understood that people who've learned to derive identity from their sensitivity, their depth, their capacity to feel things others can't feel, sometimes unconsciously use their pain as a way to feel special. Not consciously, not manipulatively, but unconsciously seeking recognition for their ability to suffer in ways that shallow people couldn't understand. When someone minimizes pain that you've unconsciously offered as proof of your depth, it doesn't just invalidate your experience. It threatens an identity you didn't know you were protecting. Think about your reaction when people minimize your pain. How much of your upset is about their lack of empathy? And how much is about not getting the recognition you unconsciously hoped for? How much of your frustration is about their inability to witness suffering? And how much is about not being seen as uniquely sensitive or emotionally sophisticated? Jung's work suggests that highly sensitive people often develop what he might call wound identity. They unconsciously begin to derive worth from their capacity to feel deeply, suffer authentically, and experience pain in ways others can't access. And when that pain gets minimized, it's not just the pain that feels invalidated. It's the identity built around being someone whose pain is more real, more profound, more meaningful than ordinary suffering. This doesn't make your pain less real, but it might explain why pain minimization feels like such a personal attack on who you are, not just what you're experiencing. But Jung's framework suggests there's an even deeper layer to this dynamic that most people miss entirely. Jung's work reveals something uncomfortable about pain minimization that most people never recognize. Sometimes we unconsciously invite it. In Jungian terms, there can be what we might call unconscious collusion in these dynamics. Part of you shares your pain, hoping it will be minimized, because being invalidated serves an unconscious psychological function. When people minimize your pain, it confirms something you unconsciously believe about yourself, that your suffering doesn't matter, that you're too much, that your emotional reality is unacceptable. For people who grew up in environments where pain was minimized, being invalidated as an adult can feel familiar, even comfortable. It reinforces patterns you learned in childhood about your emotional needs being too much for others to handle. Jung understood that we often unconsciously recreate childhood dynamics in adult relationships, even when those dynamics were painful. There's something psychologically familiar about having your pain minimized that can feel safer than having it truly witnessed. Because when someone truly witnesses your pain without trying to fix or minimize it, you have to face the full reality of your suffering. You can't hide behind the comfortable narrative that others just don't understand. When your pain is validated, you lose the unconscious protection of feeling misunderstood. You have to actually deal with the pain instead of focusing on others' inability to handle it. If this is hitting hard, tap subscribe, because Jung's framework reveals how to transform this pattern completely. Jung's insights suggest that pain minimization sometimes serves as an unconscious distraction from the real work of processing and integrating your own suffering. It's easier to be upset about others not understanding your pain than to sit alone with the pain itself. It's more comfortable to focus on their emotional limitations than to face your own relationship with suffering. It's safer to feel invalidated than to feel fully responsible for your own healing. But Jung also discovered something hopeful about this recognition. When you understand your own unconscious participation in pain minimization dynamics, you gain the power to transform them entirely. Jung's framework suggests that stopping the cycle of pain minimization requires something most people find difficult: taking full responsibility for your own emotional experience, not responsibility for causing your pain. Responsibility for how you relate to your pain and what you're unconsciously seeking when you share it. In Jungian terms, this involves what we might call withdrawal of validation projection. Stopping the unconscious expectation that others should be able to witness and understand your pain in ways that you haven't learned to witness and understand it yourself. Jung understood that the people who can truly be present with your suffering are usually people who've learned to be present with their own. And the people who minimize your pain are often people who minimize their own. When you share pain with someone who hasn't done their own emotional work, you're essentially asking them to offer you something they don't possess. It's like asking someone who's never learned to swim to teach you advanced diving techniques. The integration challenge Jung identified involves learning to meet your own pain with the presence, witness, and validation you're seeking from others. This doesn't mean becoming isolated or never sharing your struggles. It means sharing from fullness rather than from emptiness, sharing to connect rather than to be rescued. Jung's work suggests specific practices for this transformation. First, developing what he might call self-witness. Learning to sit with your own pain with presence and compassion before expecting others to do so. Second, conscious sharing. Being clear about whether you're sharing to process and connect, or unconsciously hoping for validation and rescue. Third, projection withdrawal. Recognizing when you're upset about pain minimization is really upset about not getting unconscious needs met. But Jung also understood that this work reveals something profound about the nature of authentic connection that most people never experience. Jung's framework reveals that when you stop unconsciously seeking validation for your pain, you start attracting people who can actually provide genuine witness. In Jungian terms, this creates what we might call conscious intimacy. Connections with people who have done enough of their own emotional work to be present with your full emotional reality without needing to fix, minimize, or explain it away. These people recognize that your pain doesn't threaten their psychological stability because they've learned to be stable within their own emotional depths. They can witness your suffering without taking it on, without trying to solve it, and without needing you to feel better so they can feel comfortable. But Jung understood that these connections only become possible when you stop relating to your pain as something that needs external validation to be real. When you can fully validate your own emotional experience, you stop unconsciously seeking that validation from people who can't provide it. When you can be present with your own suffering, you stop needing others to prove they can handle your depth. When you can witness your own pain with compassion, you become naturally drawn to people who offer that same quality of presence. Jung's work suggests that conscious witnesses recognize each other. People who've done this integration work naturally, find each other, because they're operating from emotional wholeness rather than emotional need. They share pain to deepen connection, not to be rescued. They offer presence because it's authentic, not because it's expected. They witness suffering because they understand its sacred nature, not because they're trying to be good people. But Jung also discovered that this transformation changes not just who you connect with, but how you relate to the people who continue to minimize pain around you. Instead of taking their minimization personally, you recognize it as information about their own unconscious limitations. Instead of feeling invalidated by their responses, you feel compassion for their inability to access emotional depth. Instead of needing them to change, you protect your emotional truth while accepting their current capacity. This is what Jung meant when he described individuation as learning to be whole within yourself, rather than seeking completion through others. Jung's framework reveals that once you understand the psychology of pain minimization, you can respond to it with wisdom rather than reactivity. When someone says, "Just think positive," you recognize their unconscious fear of negativity and protect your emotional truth accordingly. When someone offers, "Everything happens for a reason," you understand their need to believe in cosmic order, and don't let their limitation invalidate your authentic questioning. When someone suggests you're being too sensitive, you recognize their unconscious discomfort with depth and refuse to minimize yourself to make them comfortable. Jung's work suggests that conscious people learn to share their pain strategically. They develop what we might call emotional discernment, knowing who can handle their depth and who can't. They stop expecting people who minimize pain to suddenly develop capacity for emotional witness. They stop taking others' limitations as personal attacks on their experience. They stop trying to convince people to understand pain they're not equipped to handle. Instead, they protect their emotional truth while maintaining compassion for others' unconscious patterns. They share deeply with people who've earned access to their inner world through demonstrated emotional capacity. They offer surface connection to people who can only handle surface interactions. But most importantly, they become the kind of person they once needed others to be. Jung understood that when you can witness your own pain with full presence and compassion, you naturally become someone who can offer that quality of witness to others. You become the conscious person in a world of unconscious pain minimization. You become the safe person others have been looking for their whole lives. You become living proof that authentic suffering can be met with authentic presence. And you discover what Jung considered the deepest form of service, using your own integration to help others feel less alone in their own. The people who minimized your pain weren't wrong about you. They were unconsciously protecting themselves from depths they couldn't navigate. Now you can hold space for both their limitation and your truth. Now you can be present with their unconscious fear and your conscious pain. Now you can love them for their humanity while protecting your own. That's what Jung meant when he wrote about compassion that includes discernment, love that doesn't abandon wisdom, service that starts with wholeness rather than wounds. If you're ready to stop taking pain, minimization personally, and start using it as information about others' capacity, share your commitment in the comments. Not because you're superior to people who minimize pain, but because you understand that consciousness includes the ability to meet suffering with presence rather than solutions. The cycle of pain minimization ends when you become internally what you were seeking externally, a conscious witness to the full spectrum of human experience.